Hello, thank you for joining me today. I'm Frances Edmonds, Head of Sustainable Impact for HP Canada, and our session today is The Power of Purchasing for a Sustainable Future. The quote that I'm sharing with you today really shares with you the importance of figuring out how we're going to change procurement. It's very similar to that definition of insanity from Isaac Newton, I think it was, that unless we change the way we buy and what we buy, we'll just continue to reproduce the conditions for social, environmental, and economic that we had pre-pandemic. So it really is the largest opportunity we have to change our economy. So here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk about what is the definition of sustainable procurement and why we need it. I have some data on how it's practiced today in Canada, and should you choose to get started on this, how might you tackle it? And we'll have a look at some of the common issues and barriers, and we will follow this up with a live Q&A so that you can ask me any question you like. So before I get started, you might be wondering why Frances from HP is here to talk to you about sustainable procurement at your own organisation. We do this because we are Canada's most sustainable technology company, and once you have tackled climbing the beginning of Mount Sustainability in your own organisation, it really behoves any organisation to start working collaboratively. And we're going to talk a little bit about the circular economy today. And you certainly cannot do that as any individual organisation. You need to be working outside of your organisation. So we really believe this is the largest contribution we can make to Canada and the world indeed in changing how we buy to drive a more sustainable and just economy. So what is sustainable procurement? My simplest definition that I use here is purchasing the most sustainable services and products from the most sustainable suppliers. And you'll notice there that I switched goods and services deliberately, because in the circular economy, you really want to push for services over goods or products. But one of the most common criticisms that we have of sustainable procurement or naysayers is that, well, if you're doing that, isn't it going to cost more? So let's just take a little bit of a broader definition here, and this comes from Bob Willard from the Sustainability Advantage, where he's ensuring that buyers obtain the best value for money when purchasing the most sustainable services and goods from the most sustainable suppliers in support of your organization's stated purpose and strategic goals. When we think about this, particularly in Canada, a very high percentage of Canadians now live in municipalities who have declared a climate emergency. But if you look at how that municipality is actually buying, you very rarely see a requirement from their suppliers to be meeting their goals around a climate emergency. So it's a bit more around alignment and strategic goals of your own organization. So it's important to know that sustainable procurement, the definition that I'm using today, actually covers these other 4 areas, and you could even include Indigenous procurement here as well. And again, this comes from Bob Willard. But I think the thing I like here most is sustainable procurement matters to suppliers because sustainability matters to their customers or their buyers. And this is how we're going to meet our Paris targets or any of the other SDG goals, is not expecting governments to deliver on all of this, but requiring everybody in the value chain to start working on these things. And we're starting to see some very exciting movement in this space. It's been locked for a long time, but I'm starting to see interesting and fast-moving change coming. And one of the strongest signals that any organization can send into the marketplace is how you buy. Businesses exist to delight their customers, so make it a requirement that businesses should be delighting you from a sustainability standpoint. If you're looking to change your own organization, then the fastest way to green or make your own organization more sustainable is to buy from somebody who's already done that themselves. And that's from a quote by Ray Anderson from Interface Flooring. So when we think about where the risks and issues, not just carbon, but any issue, lie in an organization, the iceberg metaphor is a really good one to use. I'm going to show you HP's carbon footprint in a second, but I want you to think about what we've done over the last 100 years as we offshored and made supply chains global. Where did the risks and the issues go? They went into the supply chain. They're no longer onshored in Western countries. They've gone to other places. And these things are all things that we as buyers need to be thinking about, and not things that our customers would be willing to accept. Deforestation's been getting a lot of visibility recently. How do we actually stop deforestation happening on a global scale? We need to be thinking about supply chains. And so just take a look at these issues. Now, if we translate that into what does a carbon footprint for a major multinational like HP look like, here you can see we've been disclosing our carbon footprint for roughly, I think 5 or 6 years now. And it varies a little bit between the 3 buckets here, but when we break it into 3 areas, 50% of our impact is in our supply chain, and the other 50% roughly in our customers using our products. We have 55,000 employees in 50 plus countries. That represents still only 1% of our carbon footprint. So you can see that it's very important to be considering your own supply chain and indeed your full value chain. When we think about what is the impact of what we're buying, we need to think about extractive industries. A UN report, I think it was a 2019 report, showed that 50% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate catastrophe, and I use that term very carefully, and 80% of species loss are related to extractive industries. So that's not just drilling for oil and metals, but it's also farming. I'm going to focus on the oil and the metals because those are what goes into products like HP's. But if you lay on top of that the fact that we're over consuming, and the reason I have 4.75 planets here is because if everybody on the planet lived like a Canadian and used materials and resources in the same way, we would need 4.75 planets to support them. And we simply don't have that. So something has to change. In 2019, we dug 100 billion tons of materials out of the ground, and most of that is not being recycled. And here's how we operate our economy today. We take, make, we use, and we dispose. This is not how nature works, of course. And if you think about that use phase for something like a plastic stir stick, it could be milliseconds, and then we're throwing it back in a hole in the ground. Yet all of those impacts, from digging oil out of the ground to make plastic with the greenhouse gas emissions and the species loss, is happening, and then we're just throwing it back in a hole in the ground. It's not very efficient, and it's not the way that nature works, and it's not sustainable at 4.75 planets. So the concept of the circular economy is something that businesses like HP are planning to use to tackle these big issues. HP has a goal to be 75% circular for our products and our packaging by 2030, from a baseline today of about 40%. So the easiest way for me to explain this to you is to explain how an individual company is doing this, but then think of this at an economy-wide level. So we're making products. The first thing a circular economy requirement needs to be is to make products that are maintainable and upgradable. When we buy based on the lowest price only, we incent the wrong behavior from manufacturers to make the cheapest non-repairable product. And a good example is whether you screw components together or whether you glue them together. It's much cheaper to glue them. It's faster and you don't have to pay for the screws. But then if it breaks down, you can't repair it. You also find it much harder to recycle it properly. So trade-offs. The next thing is to be able to offer your products as a service. And we're seeing huge uptake in this. One of our consumer products as a service offerings, Instant Ink, is just selling like hotcakes because it's more convenient and cheaper for the customer. It's better for the business, and it has a lower overall environmental impact. So what's not to like about that? The next thing is to reuse and refurbish equipment like printers and PCs. And then only once you've extended the product life as long as you possibly can, you're keeping it in its highest form of value, do you take those parts, those products back and make sure you either reuse components, but definitely take everything and put it back into new products, whether it's through recycling or otherwise. And the picture of the 3D printed heart there is to remind me to talk about making sure 3D print is a great enabler of this whole system through enabling spare parts and shortening of supply chains. So that's a little look into the big picture of where procurement plays an important role and why it's important in driving a circular economy. How are we doing today in Canada? And we looked at, HP funded some research. This is academically published research into government procurement. So all levels of government, and we looked at three types of procurement. Construction, IT, and large services, which might be something like security services. And we have a white paper which you can easily access. What we found when we looked at how well was sustainability integrated into those bid documents, you can see here that 78% talked about it. Less than half actually included sustainability in the evaluation of those bid documents. And, was it an independent consideration? Only 12%, and none of them included sustainability questions that were meaningful, that would help differentiate or drive a market to be performing better. So I think we can say here that there's room for improvement. So if you did want to get started on sustainable procurement, how would you get started? What are the things that you might want to do? And I think the simple adage here is that your best and most sustainable RFX or bid document is your next one. So it's an iterative process. We're just going to keep getting better at this, and we don't want to let perfection be the enemy of just getting things done. We find a lot of organizations spend years trying to get the right policies in place and aligning and getting everybody trained up, which does take a lot of change. But meanwhile, large procurements are happening with no requirements in them. So it's much better to just get started, put a small amount in, and then continue to build from there. So one of the things we realized very early on was that many organizations don't really know where to get started. So we worked with WWF Canada to create this guide. It's fairly short and helps organizations learn about, help you create the business case, and what do you really need to do to make sustainable procurement real in your organization. So 5 steps, and I'll reiterate, just get started. So finding the right support within your organization is a key component. Mapping out what you do today, and also looking at sustainability goals. As I said, for many municipalities, for instance, they have a climate emergency, but it's not reflected in how they buy. So what could you do to look at your goals and your processes and put them together? And remembering sustainability is not just environmental sustainability, it is people, planet, and community. So find out what the gaps are, set some goals and metrics. And I would add in there to not just goals and metrics, but who's responsible for that and how are you going to measure that moving forward. There are simple ideas here. You can make it as complicated or as simple as you like, but for you to really move the needle on this, you do need to be tracking and reporting, and that needs to be shown to senior management so that they understand how little or advanced you are moving in this, and then tracking progress. And it's a simple plan, do, check, act, really. So I've already stated that buying a service over a good is an important thing from a circular economy perspective, but hopefully you'd be wanting me to show you the information and the data on that. So HP did conduct some independently peer-reviewed life cycle assessments, which is the tool we have for measuring the relative impact of 2 things. And we compared buying, in this case, I'm showing you the data from PCs, but we also did it for print and for the instant ink service at the consumer level that I mentioned previously. So you can see here that all three solutions that we looked at, the difference between buying it individually or buying it as a service, all three solutions gave lower footprint and impacts. And what was interesting here was it was across all of the impact categories in life cycle assessment. We were surprised to see that almost never happens. And I've just shown you a summary of the PC one here in the categories that we look at. DaaS stands for device as a service or product as a service for PCs. And transactional is obviously buying and owning the services there. So you can see that significant savings across the board from an environmental standpoint. So what other signals does buying as a service send into the marketplace? A couple of things. So when we're talking about IT, one of the things we find is a lot of customers still don't really plan what to do with the end of first life products that they have. And if you're talking about a PC, there's often value left in those PCs, but because nobody's really managing that or thinking about it, they just get stuffed in a closet and forgotten about. And the longer it waits to get to a second life with another user, the less likely that is to happen. So we know that if you can increase the average lifespan of your PCs, say by 2 years, you decrease the carbon footprint by 30%. So get that PC to a second life by managing it at the end of its first life and giving it to an organization, not giving it, but selling it, or making sure you're taking those into account as you buy as a service. What it also does is, if the manufacturer is on the hook for providing uptime, then they have to make sure products are repairable and that they are built to a higher quality and will last for longer. So you're sending all of the signals into the marketplace that this is the right thing to do, and you will get longer lived, more repairable, more circular products being provided to you. I have rewritten HP's Sustainable IT Purchasing Guide. You can see the URL there. This is a 30-page document with all the information you might need about IT procurement, background information to help you make good decisions. So as we wrap up here, let's really discuss the common issues and barriers. And I'll just use that quote again, that perfection is the enemy of progress. We're never going to get this right. It's always going to be evolving. Sustainability is a journey. And if it wasn't, we would have already done this. So don't be daunted by the fact that it is a journey. So the work to get us to sustainable procurement practices requires non-traditional cooperation across lines of business. And some of the pilots we've been running within the public sector, broader public sector in Canada, has really shown that sustainability and procurement in particular are two lines of business who rarely talk. When you start involving the IT people, that would just be one small example, but it does require you to start having those conversations in an open and transparent way. And the good news here is that there is a pent-up demand amongst employees to have these conversations. They're excited, they want to get involved, so just get started. I know it sounds easy, but I guarantee you'll be surprised at the level of excitement and enthusiasm that you will find as you start to open these conversations up. There's a perception that it will cost more, but I would argue that, I was talking with a customer who said, well, we don't really worry about repairability because if it breaks down, we just buy a new one. And I said, well, if you're not measuring the costs of those replacement ones and including that in, you're not really getting the best value overall. And they're not really measuring those costs. So it's important to think about full life cycle costs as well as upfront costs. There's also a perception out there that if you're asking for post-consumer recycled content, say plastics, will it be of a lesser quality of a product, and should it not be cheaper because you're using recycled materials? The reality is that virgin plastic in some cases is cheaper than post-consumer recycled plastics because you have to collect them, you have to clean them, you have to reprocess them. So it's not always going to be cheaper. And we would not be doing our customers a service if we were making an inferior product. We have worked very hard in plastics with a Canadian manufacturer, actually, to make plastics that are just as good quality. So we're very happy that we're able to do that. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating and testing them, of course. It's too complicated. And I would agree that it seems very intimidating, which is why it doesn't get done. But you don't have to eat the whole pie at once. You can take one piece at a time and just start with including some carbon considerations. Ask your vendors, do you have a carbon reduction goal aligned with the science-based target or Paris target? That's a simple question you can ask. Just by asking the question, sometimes you're sending the right signal into the marketplace. Many buyers have said to me, well, what we do won't make a difference. We're too small, we're not buying enough. But suppliers really exist to delight our customers, and it helps us invest in even more sustainability attributes when customers start to ask. It is critical that you ask these questions. Last year, HP had over $1 billion in business related to our sustainability expertise and leadership, and that makes everybody sit up and listen. So change is hard, but I would argue the business case is the strongest it has ever been to start work in this space. Employees and all stakeholders are actually demanding it. When you start to look at the number of shareholder resolutions that are happening today, the number of companies stepping up with goals around carbon reduction, net zero, it's happening very fast. And I'd argue that now is the time to get working on this stuff, because if you don't, you're going to be left behind, actually. So now is a perfect time to get started. Another criticism is that the data is not there and the metrics are lacking today. I would argue that's absolutely the case. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of ideas of what you can do as a substitute for that. Transparency in your vendors and ambitious public goals and metrics in your suppliers is very important. Traceability, so if you're requiring post-consumer recycled plastics, how do you know you're actually getting them? And one of the ways to do that is to use a type 1 type eco label as a minimum, and ePeat would be a good example of that in the tech industry. So I'm just sharing with you some transparency from an organization called CDP. They're actually a bunch of institutional investors who have a lot of money at their disposal who asked companies to start voluntarily disclosing. And they've been doing it for quite a long time now. Started with carbon or climate, went to water and forests, and more recently have done supply chain. And you can start to see companies who are committed to transparency are more committed to sustainability, I would argue. It's a good way to judge their commitments. I'm going to show you an example here of something you might think about, aligning your climate plan of your own organization. In this case, I've taken Canada and HP's and put them side by side so you can see, wouldn't you want your vendors to be aligned with whatever goals you have around carbon? And if you don't have your own goals, pick the Canadian ones or your own country ones. And here you can see more than 32 million Canadians are currently living in jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency. So this, you would expect this to be showing up in most procurement done by Canadian governments, but as you saw from the data, still to come. Circularity, we've got the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment have set some goals around this, particularly around plastics procurement. And you can see here what goals HP has and what we're doing to contribute to these. Ask your vendors to be doing the same, publicly disclosed. So wrapping up here, what kind of companies and products do you want to do business with? We're here to help and make sure that we can make all things possible. That's why I'm here talking to you today. It absolutely is possible to leverage your procurement to make an impact. And I'll leave you with a quote from Dave Packard that, it is everybody's job, and we need to lean in and make the changes necessary in this decade of climate action. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.